And now the next speakers are Mrs. Zehl from Germany and Mr. Buckley from New Zealand. And they will talk on Beyond Trauma Informed Practice, Integrating Interculturality and Intersectionality in Responses to Safeguarding Cases. Please. They are online. Here you are. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sean, you're muted.
And you have maximum 15 minutes for the presentation, just to tell you, because I can't show you these wonderful cards I have here. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you, firstly, for the opportunity for us to speak today. My name's Sean Buckley. I'm Kia ora from New Zealand. My previous experience, I was a detective with the New Zealand Police, working primarily in the child and adult sexual abuse field, and spent a number of years investigating a Catholic organisation based in the South Pacific, Australasian area, which later on went to a Royal Commission of Inquiry here in New Zealand. In later years, I've worked as an investigator, primarily dealing with safeguarding related matters for the United Nations in Africa and the Middle East. So look, it's a great opportunity for us here at OSACO, where I'm one of the founders, to do this presentation. I'm here with my esteemed colleague Claudia, who's based in Germany. Claudia's got an extensive amount of experience in the humanitarian and developmental sectors, with specialist area in safeguarding. So I'll hand over to Claudia to get started, but just before saying that, I would like to say that a lot has changed in this sector in the last 20 years, investigating of safeguarding matters. We've gained a lot of experience around interculturality and intersectionality, which are aspects that we believe are key to achieving more accurate witness and victim testimonies, and provide us with an ability to build trust, rapport, and increase the willingness of interviewees to participate in investigations. So in saying that, I'll hand over to Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome. I hope you had a fruitful conference. I was lucky to join last year in physical presence, so I hope you had a very insightful couple of days. Yes, as Sean mentioned, we wanted to draw a bit the attention on interculturality, but also intersectionality. But on top of this, also the so-called trauma-informed approach that is very often used within safeguarding case management. Yeah, and we heard it's not always an investigation. We can manage certain cases also in other ways, but we need to adopt the trauma-informed approach. However, what we have identified on behalf of OSACO through our global work in many different parts of the world over many, many years, by investigating also together with faith-based organization, but Sean will also talk about his work investigating cases in the church itself. My experience is more on the ground with faith-based organizations, not directly with the church as such. What we have identified that also when it comes to the trauma-informed practice, that this again is not a universally applied approach, but also as Sister Bernadette said, culture is never neutral. So is experience of harm and traumatic experience never neutral, and it's always experienced in a wider context of society and culture. And that's a little bit where our presentation will lead us. So our proposition or our recommendation is that everything we do, as we also heard by Sister Bernadette and probably a lot of other speakers before, culturally attuned and intersectional practices is really a foundational element of ethic, transparent and accountable safeguarding. And it's not an option. It's really something that needs to be embedded. And when we look at safeguarding and faith-based organization, it always takes place, and you will see that in the two examples that we will share. It's always within a very complex system, a system of identity, a system of culture, and culture is also not homogeneous in one country. Culture is very different from different parts of the country, as also Sister Bernadette said, within the Ghana context. And it's about spirituality and the community in a wider sense. Yeah, given a bit the limit of time, and I'm pretty sure you will receive also the slides, I don't want to stick too much on theory, even though it's the academic day, but really go to our practical examples, yeah, because that's where the learning for us as practitioners come from. So we are both not academic researchers, so we really draw our experience and our learning from practical experiences within safeguarding practices, but also within the wider humanitarian and development work. What we heard, and also Sister Bernadette mentioned that, the huge, let's say, element of trust. Yeah, so when good intentions aren't enough, yeah, or culturally misaligned approaches, even with all the good intentions, yeah, we can quietly damage safeguarding outcomes, and it undermines trust. It limits also people to come forward and disclosure, and it weakens the outcomes. Yeah, so that's on a broader sense what we have discovered in all the cases that we had looked at. So I will hand over to Sean to present us his context, and then I will talk a little bit later about Congo.
Just quickly to cover sort of the New Zealand context, or Aotearoa as we call it here. We as a nation are very multicultural, but our indigenous population are the Māori, and we have obligations to them to ensure that we take into consideration the cultural context, even around investigations. So again, I'd like to say that a lot has changed in the last 20 years, but what I have seen in more recent times is that certainly a more culturally attuned practice has been adopted right throughout government organisations, both in policing and in more recent times with the work I did with the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Faith and State-Based Abuse and Care. So here in New Zealand, and really also, I guess, following up from what Sister Bernadette had to say in the Ghana context is, a lot of the sort of cultural nuances are quite similar in many ways. And basically from an investigative point of view, I'd put it into one word, and it's respect. So it's having respect for all cultures involved in the process. Here in New Zealand, sort of some of those cultural practices are koha, so the offering of food or gesture, so sitting down and introducing yourself, explaining the process, sharing food, sharing drink, before sort of diving into the more formal part of the process. So it's taking time to understand and respect the culture around you, using the language where appropriate, and if you're going to use a different dialect that you're foreign to, it's getting your pronunciation correct. And look, I'll be the first to say that my pronunciation is terrible, as I'm sure you can hear right now. I even struggle with a bit of English. But I've always found it very useful to at least embrace some of the local language. Karakia or waiata, so prayer or song, is another important part of Māori culture, as it is with many other cultures around the world, and also having sort of a sacred space or adhering to local and indigenous protocols. So here within New Zealand, it's specific meeting places and ensuring that myself as an investigator shows respect for those meeting places and the culture that occurs, and it's not a sort of process or practice that is a like to have, We very much say it's a must to have if you're engaging with other populations and other cultures. Then out of respect, you need to adhere to the way that things are done, and listen to what's being said, instead of, which has often been the way, sort of forcing the Western way upon the rest of the world. So those are probably some of the key takeaways from my time. Over to you, Claudia.
Thanks very much, Sean. And I'm mindful with the time. So I will not rush through, but I will speed up a little bit. So the case scenario you also wanted to share with you is that on behalf of Osako, we have worked quite extensively together with Justice EP in Congo. And together with them, we reviewed and developed their own safeguarding policy. And Justice EP is a local NGO, Congolese NGO, and it's actually part of the National Episcopal Conference of Congo. So it's one of the faith-based organizations. So in the work we've done with them, it was exactly what also Sister Bernadette was saying. It was the universal standards that we have within safeguarding globally, very often coming from very westernized countries. And we really need to contextualize that. And also in the example of Justice EP, it was also to align it with the code of ethics of the National Episcopal Conference of Congo. So it was not primarily their own internal code of conduct and the national laws that exist and the universal standards, but it was also the church that needed to be incorporated. And we had a wonderful time with them. I wish I would not speak on behalf of Justice EP, but they could be here and present themselves. But hopefully next year we can do that. But we prepared everything jointly together. So one important thing, and I think it became clear also in the previous presentation, is that the Catholic Church as a key social institution is just so dominant in Congo. And if we look at the population data, and it's from 2024, so most likely it's even higher, we are talking about 110 million people living in Congo, and half of them are part of the Catholic Church, be it officially part of the church or be it believing in the Catholic Church. So we are talking about 55 million people. So that's a lot. Yeah. And if we look at the environment, we can see that the church is very much involved in a lot of other institutions, as it is in many other countries as well. It's the schools, it's the health facilities, it's universities, it's the overall community life. So we need to take that into consideration, that it's not the church as an institution, it's really in the wider spectrum. Yeah, so it's deeply, deeply embedded in social, educational, and health. I have a bit of construction work going on. I hope it's not too disturbing. Otherwise, I put my headphones on. Another thing that we wanted to point out, which is very crucial, something that I experienced a lot when working in different countries, that me, myself, I am East German, so I also came a bit from a more collective culture, but now it's more like an individual culture with many other Western countries. But when we do safeguarding, we need to look at the fact that many cultures come from a more collective approach, meaning that the self as such, the individuum as such, is not the most important thing. And that's something that we discover a lot when it comes to cases, but also when we do our safeguarding trainings on the ground, which very often involves faith-based organization, that safeguarding goes beyond the individual person. It's a lot about family. And when I talked to Justice EP, they told me very briefly that the church is seen as a family. So if you go and report a case, it's like as if you would report a case of another family member. So it's something that is so challenging and so difficult for them, because it's really the wider community. And many of the younger women that have faced harm, they also told us that if we report, we will be struggling finding a husband. Is this very disturbing or is it okay? Yeah, it's okay? Okay. So we need to take this aspect also into consideration. So the church is so much more than just an organization. It's really a system of belonging. And everybody wants to belong. And if we report, a lot of people reported to us as that they are afraid of being an outsider, that they are afraid of being kicked out of a system that they so deeply want to belong. Yeah, so it's the relationship with God, it's the identity. Yeah, religion plays a huge element of your own identity as a believer. It's the community, but also when we face harm, it often breaks more than only trust. Yeah, it is the loss of trust in the community, the loss of trust in leaders, is spiritual injury and moral injury, and it's not something that should be underestimated. It's an identity crisis. It's a lot of confusion that happens to people that we talk to. And I'm mindful with the time. Please let me know how many minutes I have. But what we also see, and I think that's where safeguarding plays such a huge role, is what are the barriers for people to come forward? And we need to understand that and deeply understand it. Because there's also cultural elements here that prevent people in the first place from reporting misconduct. And this is really...
come to the end, yeah.
All right, so it's a huge understanding of power and intersectionality in this context. There's a lot of personal factors, interactional factors, and structural factors. So I'm coming to an end by just saying that the cases that we have seen in Congo were a lot of cases of abuse of children, both male and female, sexual harassment cases in the church by asking women to constantly come to church for sexual purposes, and also cases of abuse and rape. A huge commitment needs to be done, and that's something that Justice and Peace wanted me to also say here, is that a lot of awareness raising has to be done in the rural areas, because the cases are more reported in the cities and in urban spaces, but less in rural environments. There's so much more to say, but I know we have a schedule to follow, so I'm stopping here. And I thank you a lot for your attention.
Thank you both very much. And please stay with us, because now Father Hans Zollner will moderate the discussion, the question and answer session. And I please ask all the speakers, all the two other interventions, to come up here to the podium. So, who has a question? Sister Bernard, please. We have the microphones, so please give a sign if you want to ask a question. Yes.
Mark. Hello. If you can introduce yourselves,
Yes.
and then also address your intervention, your question to one or all.
Good morning. I'm Mark Williams, clerical abuse survivor, and I'm a special advisor to the Archdiocese of Newark. I have a question for Father Joseph. Father Joseph Lee. Is that you? Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask a question related to the section on persons accused and their innocence from the perspective of a survivor. Just very briefly, you talk about what Leo said about it being a real crisis. And the 90% of victims are authentic. And then you also go on and talk about Francis saying, this should not be the only issue of the church or the central issue of the church. And it would not be an authentic response to what the world is looking for in terms of the mission of the church. But my question is then, how do you bridge the authenticity of victims and survivors with the authentic mission of the church? How do they become part of that solution of Jesus Christ, of the Paschal journey, which is the mission of the church? I don't hear enough around the world of victims and survivors being part of the solution. If we are authentic, as Leo says, how can our voices be used more for that healing, for that dignity that was in Leo's recent encyclical? So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, because it just seems like it's being relegated to an issue. To use the word issue, it's not the central issue. And yet Leo was just in Spain in 2023. The independent commission there concluded that there were 200,000 children abused in the last 4 decades. Where are those children now who are my age and adults? How are they part of the church? So I'd just like you to comment on that. Thank you.
Mike.
Thank you for your perspectives and the context that you come from. When I was doing a retreat, I was using examples of the former Archbishop and Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and his victims in the United States, and what they were saying too. So very much aware that the voice of the victims is there, and listening to some of the speakers and some of McCarrick's victims as well too. I don't have any solutions or answers to how the voices of victims, because I'm only just simply quoting what the Holy Fathers have said, and maybe it's going to be at the level, so at the universal church level, what bodies or what groups or what institutions can give a lead in that. And at the diocesan level, say the local church, from the point of view of the diocese, so in the Archdiocese of Newark you have Cardinal Tobin as the Archbishop there. What is the diocesan bishop in each of our contexts is leading, and what their commissions or vicars or safeguarding officers are doing, so at the diocesan level. Then of course that will then filter down to the local parish and church and volunteer levels as well too, what can be done there too, and also to engage directly. So as victims, the church might want to ask, how would the victims like to inform? Because when Father Zollner was in Australia, he was saying that not all victims have one voice, and some are after compensation, but others aren't after compensation. So the diversity of victims' voices and victim survivors, and who is a victim, who is a survivor, varies. And so that maybe in the multiplicity of the number of survivors and victims, can they actually, because sometimes they might ask us, well, what would you like? And on the phone they say, oh, I'm not sure what I want at this stage. So we ask, well, come back maybe if they approach us directly. It's a sensitive area, so I'm not too sure how, so I may come back to you, sir. Do you have any suggestions about how to involve all that? But that's so that, yeah. So, but definitely hear what you're saying. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We don't want to engage in a public conversation here now. If you want to clarify later on, just one thought from my side. This question of first, where victims are listened to. Second, where they find a place where there is place offered or made available, so that in the process of, for example, talking about what the expectations from the victim survivor side is one of the most difficult, as we have heard also in Sister's presentation, because the cultural opportunities, the traditional customs influence very much what is available and what not. And what we have just heard from Congo also in the online presentation, even speaking out against one's own family, of which one feels part, that is the church, is very different in different parts of the world. So again, as we have heard a number of times, there is no one size fits all. It's different in Newark and the US and in Australia and wherever, Western countries. But this is also one of the, let me say, opportunities of this gathering, that we take home elements of, for example, creation of platforms that are adapted to the context and the cultural possibilities, but also asking those systems that are already established, where is, for example, the social component in attending to victims and survivors and accompanying them in a Western and more individual approach. Yeah. So I think your question is very pertinent, and thank you for bringing that up. And this is probably one of the most needed discussions that we don't have in many places. So keep up speaking up. Yeah? Thank you.
Sorry, excuse me. I just wonder if I could add to that, if possible.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just look, having undertaken investigations all around the globe into these matters, I would highly recommend everyone perhaps having a look at the way that the Royal Commission of Inquiry in New Zealand undertook their work. They made it very clear that survivor and victims' voices were heard right throughout the process. It was a complete change from what I was used to as a police detective. But I must say I got some fantastic learnings out of it. So their voice was always at the table. They were included right throughout the investigation process, along with their advocacy groups. Didn't take away from sort of the stringent measures and processes around the investigation, but it was always ensured that they had a voice. So if anyone gets the opportunity to have a look at how that Royal Commission was set up, I would highly recommend it. There's some great learnings there. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you. Yes, there are already good examples, and this one from New Zealand is surely one we should look at. First, Sister now.
Sister Manuela from Poland. I also have the question for Father Joseph. What is your opinion? Because I think that it's more important for canon law, in canon law, canon 220. 220 and response dicastery of legislative text, they said that this canon protects every person. What do you think? What is your opinion? Thank you.
Canon 220 is on privacy, and it says that every member of the Christian faithful has the right to privacy, and that was one of the points which was raised, I think, in which I didn't get time to get to, was to do with the publication of lists of accused persons, which is a practice which happens some places. I think it's the quotation for the dicastery for legislative texts, and it's from the handout. I think it's on
page 3.
Page 3, yeah, where the bona fide defuncti, so that the rights of the deceased, if in some places will publish names of credibly accused, but the dicastery for legislative texts, which is one of the Roman dicasteries, gives the opinion that it's the principle of the assumption of innocence and it goes against the also to maintain the privacy of deceased because they can't defend themselves. So that's a very important canon, Canon 220, about the right, and it uses the language of human rights. So when they're formulating the code, they did, of course it was after the UN Declaration of Human Rights, they deliberately used the language, the rights of the Christian faithful too, and they list the rights, and one of the rights is everybody has the right to defend their privacy, and the church does respect that. So on one hand there is transparency, but the canon does speak about the right of every Christian member of the Christian faithful to defend their privacy.
Thank you. Father?
My name is Father Greg Lewitt from the United States, and I have a question. I'm a canon lawyer, also judicial vicar for our diocese. It's a two-part question, real simple. One, I've heard this quotation from Pope Leo regarding 10% are cases are not of accused clerics may be false. He said it not only before he was a pope, he said it when he was a cardinal. Do you know the source of his information regarding the statistic? And then secondly, it's a little more general, more theoretical, how can we create a synodal process such as a review board on a local level or some other structure in order to hear those who have been harmed, but also so that the bishops then will also be hearing what is being said to create not only policies, but to begin in some ways to create part of the structure, this need for the people to be involved in the process. Do you have any general thoughts on how that might be done? Thank you.
Thank you, Father. I don't know the actual source. It was I think that came from the interview of Elise Allen, and it was, I think it's an interview that cruxnow.com had hosted, and then it also was published on the Vatican's own website. So, but I think the source was the interview and His Holiness didn't actually say, but I think the interviewer asked, and then he gave that answer. So I don't know the source, and then so I'm not too sure about that, the source of his numbers. And then the second question about how the synodal process, maybe the United States, I think from what I understand, you have a system of the institutional review boards in dioceses, so maybe and that they have a governance role in the diocese, from what I understand. That may be one model, and again, how the local church in our own situations and cultures, and we've heard from some of the speakers how embedded the church is in many cultures, and how, as you know, in some of the Europeans, and for example, the province of Quebec in Canada, or France, the dethronement of the church in Ireland, in other places, how that would then affect it. So if the church is very embedded in the culture and is part of the governance and maybe the second largest employer of people in the country, that context would be different from one where the church is at the margins, so that in many Western places the church is at the margins, so how the process might be different there. So thank you. Thanks for the question too.
May I add one thing on the numbers? So I think something like that, 10% are false allegations. These numbers go around since many years. And this is a perfect example of one, that unverified numbers go around and are perpetuated also by media. Secondly, this is a perfect example of how difficult it is to really get to the establishment of verified and verifiable statistics. What does a false allegation mean? That's not clear. It's not clear what level of verification you have. In common law systems, like the US, you have 3 categories of allegations. You have your allegation, you have an unsubstantiated allegation, you have a substantiated allegation, and you have then a conviction. So there is a differentiation that doesn't exist in other law systems. So is an unsubstantiated allegation a false allegation or not? I'm just highlighting that the closer you get and the more detailed you ask, the more complex things are. And of course we have proven cases of false allegations for whatever reason, willingly or unwilling, consciously or unconsciously attacking, accusing others for revenge or whatever. We have proven cases of that. But compared to the number of unknown allegations that could have been brought forward by victims who are unknown, this is probably a very small number. I don't say any percentage, but anyway. So here we have one final question.
Thank you. My question goes to Father Joseph. Thank you for your presentation. Yes. Thank you for your presentation. Could you clarify whether canon law provides a mechanism for addressing cases in which a lay employee of the church abuses a minor or a vulnerable adult? If so, what specific provisions would you apply? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question because some of those documents were quoted to do with the Vos Estis, Lux Mundi, and the Vivecum. They only apply to clerics, and of course that's a bishop, a priest, or a deacon. And then there's a part of Vos Estis, Lux Mundi, that's the second version, which do apply to moderators of international lay associations. So that's at the top level of leadership. So you couldn't say superior general at the top level of the lay association, the moderators of those ones. But there is no equivalent of Vos Estis, Lux Mundi for the lay employees. You're right, that there's no canonical, because at the moment what the Holy Father's brought out is to do with clerics. And same thing with the canonical investigations in Canon 1717, they refer to canonical investigations of the bishop, the priest, and the deacon. And Vos Estis, Lux Mundi was essentially saying how to report bishops, because the failings was the reporting of bishops. So Cardinal Sulpicius's metropolitan model became what was became the basis of Vos Estis, Lux Mundi, about reporting to the metropolitan about the bishop and the failings of the bishop and the clergy as well. But you're right, there is a gap in the how to report the lay. So in that case, maybe you might have to report on the civil law, because some of those requirements for regulators, that you have to report a teacher, a doctor, a psychiatrist, a nurse, practitioner, or anyone who's got contact with young people who's vulnerable, that you might have to report to the state authorities. But you're right, there's a gap in the church regarding for the lay employees.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our presenters. Let us give them a hand of applause.